He's received the Sierra Club's Ansel Adams Award for Photography and Conservation and a Doctor of Humane Letters from his alma mater, Colorado College. In 2019, he was honored as one of Utah's 15 most influential artists. Trimble speaks and writes as a conservation advocate and has taught writing at the University of Utah. He makes his home in Salt Lake City and in the Red Rock country of Torrey, Utah. And you can find more of his work at stephentrimble.net. And without further ado, I will turn the time over to the man himself. Thank you.
Even with this small group, I'm going to use the mic so that I can make sure you hear me.
What?
So thank you all for coming. Thanks to Tony and Catherine Weller for keeping the Weller dynasty going here in Trolley Square. When I first moved to Salt Lake 35 years ago, the first reading I did at Sam Weller's downtown was for my Great Basin book, The Sagebrush Ocean. And Sam and Lila took me to lunch at Lamb's across the street. And I felt like I had really moved to Salt Lake. It was great. So thanks to them. Also thanks to Leslie Browning at Homebound Publications for publishing this little book. It's kind of a peculiar little book, you know, it's a little book. It's an unusual length for a book. And Leslie is virtually a one-person publishing company who started this Little Bound Book series. And I think that this particular book fits the series really well. So what do we have here? What is this little book of mine? It is the story of my brother. I had a brother when I was a little kid. I had a big brother, Mike, who was 8 years older than me. My mother's child from her brief disaster of her first marriage. And my mom married my father when Mike was 5, and I came along 3 years later. Mike was slow to learn. He was a sweet kid, but slow to learn as a kid, and diagnosed as retarded, the word that we used in those days. And every night my mother worked with him at the kitchen table, sitting down at the yellow formica of our kitchen table and doing heroic tutoring with Mike to get him through the first few years of elementary school. And then he went into special ed in middle school and became quite emotional, volcanically emotional. And that takes us very quickly into a scene that I'm going to read to you. It was one of my very few memories of Mike living at home. And I was just a little kid, and when Mike became volcanic, I got scared. And so I'm going to read you the first few pages of the book, which really, in many ways, began my journey toward this book. And because this memory was so embedded in my brain. I am 6. I tuck between the wooden studs in the garage, folding into a ball, my hands over my ears. Buckshot sprays of angry words fly at me through the open kitchen window. Summer heat fills the garage. I stare at the stipple of oil stains on the concrete floor and monitor the dust motes as they float from lightless corners through golden sun shafts. I jam myself deeper into the corner, aching to disappear, anything to distract from the incoming missiles packed with anguished words. In the kitchen of our little house in the Denver suburbs, my teenage brother, Mike, towers over our mother, Isabelle, his arms braced around her. He cages her against the wall. Mike is big, almost 6 feet tall at 14. He screams at our mother. You love Stevie more than me. You put me in school with retards. Everyone yells at me. Everyone tells me I'm messed up. Too much trouble. Stupid. Sick. He aims his rage especially at my father, Don, who is Mike's stepfather. For Mike is Isabelle's son from her brief disaster of a first marriage. I hear you and the stepdad talking. I hear you. You want to send me away. You hate me. I hate you. Mom does her best to speak calmly, to talk him down. I hide in the garage. Indeed, I hide from Mike's story for a very long time. I can reclaim only a few moments from my earliest years with my brother. I remember Mike's silly giggle and grin before his broken brain swept him away, his in-your-face enthusiasm, a giddiness with an edge, a little too ferocious, a little unsocialized, a little manic. That daunting summer afternoon in our Denver home in 1957 eclipsed any other joyful memories. A few days after Mike's searing confrontation with our mother, my parents, at wit's end, admitted him to Colorado Psychopathic Hospital for evaluation. Mike never spent a night at home again. And so Mike received his second diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, capable of violence. And so my parents really felt like they had no choice but to have Mike committed. And he moved to the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo, a couple hours drive south of Denver where we lived, for the next 10 years. And I continued to live at home with my parents and started to grow up. But there were surprises in that growing up. And one of those surprises came along when I was about 10. I was bored. I wandered out to the garage again to poke around, looking for something novel, something diverting. My dad had built 3 shelves across the back of the garage, stacked with boxes of seldom used dishes, dusty suitcases, occasionally used tools, outgrown toys. My grandmother's wooden shafted golf clubs from the 20s, short enough for me to use, each iron stamped with a quaint name, Mashy, Niblick. My dad's well-worn custom boots, ready for the endless miles he'd walk in his next field season, mapping the West for the U.S. Geological Survey. I always found it eerie that a wooden model of his foot lived in the back room at White's Boots in Spokane, Washington, poised for his order whenever he needed a new pair. This day, I found a green metal file box I'd never noticed. The box had a locking clasp, but when I pushed down the latch, the top popped open. Inside were documents and records. Who cared about auto titles and house insurance? But there was more. Folders labeled with names, Stevie, Mike. Temptation overrode any concern about discretion. I pulled out the certificate that recorded my brother's birth. The document said that Michael David Scher, S-H-E-R, had been born on December 31st, 1942, to parents identified as Isabelle Virginia Brinnig, 21 years old, and not Donald Trimble, my father, but someone named Maury Lewis Scher, 30. Line by line, these typed words burned into my brain circuitry. Our mother was married before she married my dad. The birth certificate logged a wedding in Butte, Montana, where Mom had been born into tightly connected families of immigrant Jewish retailers. I thought I knew my family. My Brinnig grandparents now lived in East Denver. We saw Mom's sister Charlotte and her family all the time. I thought of my mother as an unchanging, dependable constant. These were the defining walls of my world. But who on earth was Maury Scher? How could I not know that Mike and I had different fathers? I felt betrayed. So I went to my mother, and I asked her, what happened? Who was this? How could I not know that we had different fathers? And she just wilted. She said that she had married this guy to get out of the little town in Montana where she lived, so that it was an escape, and came to Denver. And within a year, she had a child. He was abusive. She divorced him. She was done. She really didn't want to talk about it ever again. And she went ahead and married my father, and we had a family. I'm just trying to remember where I am here, what I'm going to do next. Mike continued to live at the state hospital for about 10 years, and then in 1966, he was mainstream. He was in his 20s, I was in high school, and that was the era when we started to move everybody out of state hospitals and back into communities, with the idea that there would be community mental health centers to take care of them. Unfortunately, we defunded those community mental centers almost immediately. And so my brother ended up living in halfway houses for another 10 years. He never ended up on the street, as far as I know. But he came back to Denver, where we kind of assumed he would join our family again, come to dinner, sit down at the seat that he had vacated 10 years before. And it was so turbulent, so emotionally challenging for him to be with this tight little threesome that my parents and I had become, that he would leave. Every time he'd come for dinner, he would storm out. And after trying that a few times, He stormed out one Thanksgiving, that first fall, and that was it. And the next summer he wrote my mom a series of letters, basically cutting off contact with us. And he had been talking to his counselors who agreed that it was simply too emotionally difficult for him to be with us. My mom read the letters. I can't even imagine how she read them once. But she read the letters and she saved them. And so I have the letters. I'm going to read you the first one. They came in a stream that summer after Mike returned to Denver. Thursday, June 1st, 1967. To Mom. Listen, I love you and all that, but still you should have realized what you did wrong to yourself and me. You made some of the worst mistakes that any mother should ever make. You took everything out of my life. Why don't you admit to yourself what you did wrong? Because you didn't get anything out of your life when you were a child. You wanted to take and mess your own son's life up entirely. Well, I'll tell you did a darn good job of it. I didn't want to ever hear from you or the stepdad. You better leave me alone entirely from now on. I mean business. You think I'm a fool. I'm a lot smarter than you put me on to be. You people are sick, selfish, and very unfair. I will send you people something for remembrance. I'd been better off in an orphanage after I was born, because you sure didn't deserve me one bit. So leave me alone forever. I am just sorry you deprived me of everything, because if I had good framed peace of mind, I'd probably be in business for myself. Today you ruined me, but have a good summer anyway. Love, Mike. The letters just go back and forth from these accusations and acrimony to apology. You know, Mike was clearly wanting this to work, but he knew that it couldn't. And the letters are just filled with such pain. So that was in 1967, and I'm about ready to head off to college at this point. And Mike continues to live in these halfway houses, and we don't see him. He really stuck by his decision to cut off contact with us. My mom sends him spending money. They exchange cards at holidays and birthdays. I send him a carton of cigarettes or aftershave or something generic for his birthday. And that's it. And I rarely even think about him. But one more time, he comes back into my life. On a cold winter gray day in 1970, I drive through downtown Denver in our inelegant old pinkish tan 1962 Dodge Dart, the family car now passed on to me. I'm home from college on winter break, running errands. Multi-lanes of traffic carry me down Broadway, through the heart of the city, the heart of the state. The Capitol rises to my left, its gold dome incandescent in low-angled light. Off to the right, khaki-colored grass leads past leafless, black branching trees reaching skyward, the imposing Civic Center behind. Steam plumes from vents, the breath of the city. A line of people stands on the curb, bundled up for winter, waiting, watching, or maybe just killing time. And there's Mike, at the front of a cluster of folks at a bus stop. He wears that same scowl of unhappiness I remember. He's a slouching column of dark tallness, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. I slow down. I grip the wheel, hesitant, agitated, but I can't quite get myself over to the curb. I want to stop. I'm scared to stop. My AM radio blasts the Beatles, the long and winding road that leads me to your door, and Let It Be, conflicting advice. No help there. I'm riveted to Mike as I roll by. He doesn't make eye contact. Even if he saw me, he might not recognize me. Mike wanted nothing to do with us, right? What in the world would I say? I don't pull over, roll down the window, call to him. Before I know it, I'm past, still clutching the wheel. I do not drive around the block to give myself a second chance to push through my uncertainty, wondering how I could coax people out of their rooms rather than go door to door upstairs, which the boarding home managers usually wouldn't allow. I got the idea of bringing my 5-string banjo into the lobbies and just sitting there and playing, The banjo is a loud instrument, and many people don't like it. I've been playing it since high school, still do, and found it worth a try. And it worked. People began coming downstairs to see what the racket was. I remember letting several of them hold the banjo and try to play it, and even one guy who had played a banjo once in his life. He was ecstatic to strum an old country tune. I sang a few songs, and in between, I'd ask the people questions about their lives. Was Mike one of those who came down? I wish I knew. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So in working on this book, it really became my story as much as Mike's story. And that was the real journey for me. I started out with a very big manuscript. I wanted to know who my mom was at 20 when she got married and had Mike. And so I did all kinds of family history about Jewish immigrants in Montana and my mother's extended family going back to the old country. And it was great for me to learn all that, but it was not great for the reader. And all of my readers said, get rid of all that and concentrate on this story. We want to know about you. How did you feel about this? And so eventually I got to the core of the story. But it took a while. And what really triggered it was after everyone had died, Mike had died years ago, my parents had died, there was this envelope that my mother had saved, a manila envelope with her block letters on the front that said Mike. And she saved a few fragmentary medical records and Mike's letters. She tried throwing it away at one point. She just didn't even want it in the house. And my dad retrieved it from the garbage. And after my mom had died, and my dad was in his 90s and losing his sight, he called me one day and said, I think I threw away the Mike file. We always called it the Mike file, by mistake. And he was quite distraught. But when my dad died, and we went through his files, there it was. It was deathless. It was not going to go away. And so I spilled, after about a year after my dad died, I spilled the contents of that file across my desk and said to myself, okay, I need to deal with this. I had avoided bringing it back home for years, even when my dad encouraged me to. But it was there, and I needed to grapple with Mike's story and figure out who my brother was and what his life meant to me. The book is subtitled A Story of Grief and Hope. You've heard a lot about grief, so where's the hope? And I think the hope came right out of the process of writing this story. The hope came from my being willing to stand and look at Mike and say, I see you. I see you. And that's what I think gives all of us hope if we have someone like Mike in our world. Father, mother, sister, brother, friend, son, daughter. Almost, turns out this is a universal story. Almost all of us have someone whose story is not so dissimilar somewhere in our lives. And so the hope comes from our moving past denial, moving past shame, moving past secrets, and standing up in the world and saying, I see you. And as I do that with Mike, as I have found even past finishing the writing of the book, as I continue to talk about Mike in readings and interviews, it becomes more and more real, which is gratifying and kind of amazing. So let me read you one last section from toward the end of the book. My mother never thought of herself as strong, but she was. Isabelle beat the odds bestowed by her inheritance of an inordinate number of family sorrows. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, abuse, disability, depression, rejection, and lies. Alcoholism, abandonment, suicide, and madness scattered misfortune through her family and her life, some closer in, some farther away. I'm grateful to mostly have avoided these calamities, the hazards that run in our genes. I'm grateful my children have as well. I didn't escape unscathed. I've opened the Mike file. I've held the letters and the stories and the grief in my hands. I've felt tender. I have felt vulnerable. I've felt fear about what I'd find. And I've realized that I define myself in part as not Mike. I've supposed I was a simple, stable person by nature, and maybe that's true. But when I saw how hard Mike was on our family, I surely chose to be the opposite. I ventured back into the past as the man I am now, content, in my 60s. In my 60s when I wrote this, edging into my 70s now. I began with research, my comfort food. I tracked down documents, Isabelle's and Maury's divorce records, Maury's death certificate, Mike's autopsy report. I untangled family history, interviewed psychiatrists and social workers and elders in the Denver and Butte Jewish communities. Let me get this page turned. I tracked the evolution of mental health treatment in 20th century America. I asked obscure cousins and my difficult Aunt Charlotte to share their unvarnished memories. I met Maury Scher's surviving family. As I reconstructed Isabelle's life and heritage, as I traced the parallel tracks of Mike's journey in the history of our treatment of mental illness, all these notes and words and drafts eventually brought me back to myself. Mike's life brings me closer to my own life, closer than I've ever been to knowing myself. I also realized that I never separated fully from my parents. My wife, Joanne, reading draft after draft of this book, urged me to replace all those we's with I. She kept telling me with exasperation, this book is not about we, it's about you. And I kept answering, but that's how my parents and I felt. It's a family story. But I finally got it when Joanne said, your parents could have written this. You weren't Mike's parent, you were his brother. How did you feel? I'm shocked that self-realization takes so long, but now I no longer think of myself as mostly an only child. Mike was there too, all along, shaping our family, shaping me, and his disappearance from our family was a grievous loss. I was deprived of a relationship with my brother, and that was a subtraction from what would have been a richer life for both of us. I've come in from the garage, where it turns out I've been hiding for more than 60 years. I've rejoined my family, even if many of them are gone. I've waited until I felt safe before I could own the mental illness that flares in our lineage through multiple generations. Finally, I can risk turning to each of these characters in my life with more understanding than I've ever before brought or sought. As these people from my life drift away into memory, I don't want to lose them. My fragile raconteur of a mother, my kind, fierce scientist father, my storm cloud of a brother. Generation to generation, we tumble along in a maze of family emotion and energy. The network of trails connecting these characters expands as elders die and new rounds of children appear and grow up in all of their challenging and endearing humanity. In her essay, The Empathy Exams, Leslie Jameson concludes that empathy is a choice we make to pay attention, to extend ourselves. I arrived late, but I've made my choice. Thank you. So now we can have a conversation, and that's all the reading that I will do, but I'm open to any questions or comments you guys have. And I hope you do.
That was a quick observation by Joanne. I noticed myself when you were reading the earlier parts, the use of the we, and how sort of snug it felt. Not snug as in like arrogance, but as like a kind of safety unit. And how I didn't grow up in a family like that. And so I know that there must have been really rich positive parts of that, and then it must have been also, I don't know if it was part of why it was difficult for Mike to do that or not, but I was aware of that week.
Mm-hmm.
But the question I have for you is, I really love what you said about, how did you put it, just showing up and seeing the person. And if Mike was alive today, what would that look like for you? 'Cause, like for me, I have relatives who are mentally ill, and it's not easy to, well, it's either impossible or not easy to see, and next to impossible, or they don't want to be seen here. It's a whole story, but what would it, you wrote this book after the other people in your family died, which is really different than when they're alive, and so it made me curious, like what, if they were alive, what would that seem?
Terry, I kind of in the book imagining that scene, so I'm not going to tell you too much about that, so that when you get to that scene,
All right, I'll look forward to it.
you'll find the answer. But one of the most difficult questions that I've been asked is, what would my parents think of this book? What would my mother think of this book? I'm not quite sure. I'm being very public about her story and our story. And I think she'd be pretty taken aback, but I think she'd probably figure out how to deal with that. My father, I think, would understand when I'm doing better. But I would so much love to have that chance to talk to Mike. But I do imagine a better life for Mike toward the end of the book. And we know how to do that. We don't do it. We don't fund it. But we know how to take care of people with mental illness. We just don't do it. And that's partly because it's primarily because of lack of funding. And the reason we have no money to do this right is because, as somebody pointed out to me, the mentally ill don't have a very strong lobby. It's not nearly as strong a lobby as Big Pharma, who wants, the derivatives of Thorazine to still be used. The drugs are better now, for sure. But only about 2 out of 5 people with mental illness actually have access to treatment. And some cities are better than others, some states are better than others. But 1 out of 5 adults in America experience mental illness each year. 1 in 25 serious mental illness. 1 in 6 youth, 6 to 17, experience a mental disorder every year. And it's everywhere.
So to go back to the choice your mother ended up making, so she takes Mike to the hospital, they do their diagnosis and keep him, right?
And
Keep him.
yes.
So, and obviously that has its really, you can see that in his very articulate letters. I assume that's what he's referring to, that he was abandoned by her. What would, if we had world enough in time and funding enough in time, what would have been a better way of resolving this situation?
So it was 1957.
Yeah, but if it were today.
But I just want to emphasize that there really was not even a field of child psychology at that point. There was no family therapy. There were no community health centers. There was, if you were wealthy, there were private and expensive places where you might put your child, the way the Kennedys did, famously with Rosemary. And so there really was very little choice at that point. Now, a lot of it has to do with the diagnosis. Virtually every healthcare worker, psychologist, psychiatrist that I've interviewed has been very doubtful about Mike's diagnosis. 1/3 of mentally ill people in the 50s were diagnosed as having schizophrenia, which was crazy. They just used it as they described it as sort of a waste bucket diagnosis. And as my psychologist friends and the people I've interviewed have read Mike's letters and heard of Mike's stories, they just keep downgrading his diagnosis to maybe he was bipolar, maybe he was on the autism spectrum, maybe he just had depression and learning issues. His IQ was measured at about 75 or 80, which is definitely subnormal, but as you can tell from the letters that they're quite articulate. And so
he probably was heavily drugged for many of those years at the hospital, so it's hard to know how devastating the experience was if he was given what one of the writers I rely on calls a chemical lobotomy, like too much Thorazine. But when he came out, and who knows what drugs he was taking at that point, all those records were destroyed. He was much more aware of what he'd gone through. So what we could have done in those early days is what we might do now. Better drugs, lots of help at school, constant therapy, talk therapy, and
But still living at home.
maybe some live at home, some don't. Every family that has someone who struggles with this.
Yeah.
And I've been getting a lot of emails from people that read the book who tell me the story of a similar person in their life. And it often is someone who is out on the streets and disappears for a period of time, and then they'll hear from them when they're arrested. And then they'll go to a hospital and come out and take their drugs for a little while, and they'll see them, and maybe they'll live at home for a little while, and then they have another break and disappear. You know, it's a repeating cycle. We haven't made a huge amount of progress.
So if I.
Your parents, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna interpret the answer. There's no easy answer to how it could have gone better then, or even how it could have gone better.
It's not an easy answer, and it's definitely an answer to strive for rather than something that really happens very often. It's just.
I was just wondering when Mike was hospitalized, were your parents and mom able to go visit him?
Yeah, I write about that a little bit in the book. But what I don't know is what happened immediately after Mike's committal. You know, I don't know if he saw us again. You know, was he just taken directly from the diagnosing hospital in Denver to the state hospital in Pueblo? One of the people in Pueblo told me that he would probably have been taken by a sheriff and probably in restraints. It would have been terrifying for him. The superintendent at the Colorado State Hospital at that time, there were 6,000 people there, would tell parents to not visit. He would tell them, act like these people are dead to you. You'll just upset them. My parents did not do that. They visited. And when I got a little older, I would go with them. They would go about once a month. And sometimes Mike was well enough for them to take him to lunch downtown in Pueblo and go sit in the park. And sometimes he was too ill for them to even see him. And it was a scary experience for me. I remember driving in to the campus of the state hospital, and you know, there are these old brick buildings, all of them locked. You know, it was a weird place. And my mom would cry all the way home every time. That's the grief in the subtitle.
I am a clinical social worker, and I spent 9 years working in pediatric unit here at our state hospital. And I'm just curious to know if you have connected with NAMI Utah or any other organizations similar to NAMI to kind of offer to maybe do a talk for them, and I think you'd get a lot of people maybe interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So NAMI is the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and it's the main organization nationally that gives support to families. And I've been reaching out. I actually haven't reached out right here in Salt Lake, but I've been in touch with National NAMI and Colorado NAMI.
Okay.
And thank you for reminding me to reach out here, because I am here after all. It turns out they're a little bit hard to reach because it is a volunteer organization.
Yes.
There's not a lot of staff to respond. But thank you for reminding me.
I know, still know a number of people who work at our state hospital who might be able to connect you with them or might be interested.
That'd be great.
We're doing something with them in terms of like the families that they work with currently. So I'd be happy to help where I can.
Yeah, let's talk afterwards, and we can exchange contacts. That'd be great. There's one little section of the book that is kind of I don't even know what word to use. It's both devastating and intriguing and kind of silly on one level. There was a book published in right around 1960 called The Caretakers, written by a woman named Darielle Telfer. and it became a bestseller. And she had worked at the Colorado State Hospital, and it's a real bodice ripper. There is lust and rape and murder and everything you can imagine in there. But the sections where she describes what it's like for the nurses working in the wards in the state hospital were described by the reviewers as pretty much the way it was. And so I used that description as the best description I have of what Mike's life might have been like day to day. And that book was eventually made into a movie with Joan Crawford and Polly Bergen, and JFK was so intrigued with it. Once it became a movie, it became much more didactic. It was sort of a call for reform. President Kennedy actually had it screened for Congress. It was the first movie that was ever screened for Congress as a kind of call for reform. And he did achieve some reform just before he was assassinated. But you know, those descriptions of the wards would have been written at the time when Mike was there. And again, I so much want Mike's life to lead toward a bit of reform. That was one way it led toward reform. And then I mentioned Pat McGuire's series of Lost Souls articles in the Denver Post. That kind of led toward a big lawsuit against lack of care for mentally ill people in Denver that went on for years and years and years, and eventually led to some money, actual money, for group homes and the formation of the Mental Health Center of Colorado that provides treatment. And it's a little bit of a stretch to tie it all back to Mike, but not a complete stretch to his death.
Were you able to get access to any of the medical records over those years, see what they actually said about him? Did they ever try to understand him and the family at all? Or?
I have only the medical records my mom saved, which were really just lists of diagnoses. And all of the treatment records were destroyed at the state hospital in the 80s. And so I can't get to them. I did get his school records where his teachers were describing what it was like in elementary school. It's amazing what's still out there. But I couldn't, there were no records from the state hospital.
What did the teacher say?
I'm going to let you read that in the book.
Okay.
But they saw a lot. Terry, last question.
Oh, okay,
Go
so
ahead.
you speak about grief. You speak about grief. I'm wondering if you feel or struggle with any sense of guilt in your family and how you reckon with it. Not saying it's justified.
Yeah, my mother certainly felt guilt, but she didn't talk about it. You know, it was a different era. People didn't talk about this stuff. I feel guilt now, but I can't hold myself too responsible because I was a kid. You know, even when Mike died, I was still in my 20s, and when he was really in need of support from us, you know, I just wasn't available. So, you know, there is guilt, but maybe less than you might think.
Isn't this what's called survivor guilt? That is, the one who survives feels guilty because the other person died?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, survivor guilt. Well, it feels to me like that is long enough. So thank you all very much.
Thank you,
And
Steve.
I will be happy to sign books if you want to buy a book. And thanks to Wellers for hosting this. Thank you.